is something I saw come up weirdly often in 2020, especially around the end of this, well, it was definitely a year, is the lack of Marvel movies. Apparently going a whole year without them, despite everything else going on, was so devastating that, and I quote from The Verge, it left a pop culture void. Whatever that means. But let's say you're still in the mood for costume stuntmen and okay CGI, but are more or less all Netflixed out, and don't feel like wasting 4 hours to hear Batman want to look cool on Reddit. So grab your helmets, slap on a belt, rev your motorcycle and transform, build up, progress, get to... What are they using now? Okay, that's cool. And hey, it turns 50 this year. We're talking about Kamen Rider.
Let's go! 輝くマシン
For those not in the know, in which case I'm surprised you decided to watch this video, or maybe need a little refresher, Kamen Rider is a Japanese superhero series originally created in the early 70s by manga artist Shotaro Ishinomori and TV producer Toru Hirayama. The original Kamen Rider series was first intended to be an adaptation of Ishinomori's manga Skullman, but was reworked after the somewhat dark anti-hero one-shot seemed to be a bit much, and made into something to be a bit more fitting for an all-ages audience. By which I mean a college student is transformed into a cyborg grasshopper man by an organization partially ran by Nazis, escapes before they can finish, fights back against them in their other experiments, and rides off into the sunset on his motorcycle. Amazing stuff. If you grew up in the 90s and the choreography and style of the costume design seem vaguely familiar to you, you may be thinking of Super Sentai, better known here as its more westernized counterpart, Power Rangers, which was also conceptualized by Ishinomori. The popularity of Kamen Rider and Super Sentai, along with kaiju movies such as Godzilla and Gamera, have become collectively known over the years as the genre referred to as tokusatsu, a term basically meaning live-action movies or TV shows that use lots of special effects. 50 years later, Kamen Rider is still kicking and being one of the biggest names of the genre. How Kamen Rider works as a series is that every season is its own self-contained story. Something entirely new is brought to the table, within another time, another place, and with a whole new set of characters and interpretation of how the Rider system works. It's kinda like Final Fantasy, with how despite there being a numbered series and a whole slew of spin-offs, none of them were exactly connected, or in the case of the main series, are intended as sequels for the previous one unless it's explicitly stated otherwise, with the occasional sort of semi-canon crossover bringing a huge chunk of the protagonists together, in Kamen Rider's case usually consisting of certain movies. The first couple of series, known as the Showa era, based on them being made during that particular Japanese era, had each rider with a fairly similar motif, but with their own approach to the story. But over the years, as well as eras, each one has started to have their own motif or gimmick that strays away from the simplicity of the original and creates something new, such as EX-Aid, with a motif inspired by games, where each rider uses special cartridges called gashats and gains looks, abilities, and weapons based on the type of game. For example, the main protagonist using one based on classic platformers. Or Drive, who trades in the iconic motorcycle every rider usually has besides them for a children's go-kart. Or ZO, who uses the ability to time travel to fight alongside past Kamen Riders, eventually being able to use their abilities in order to change the past and create a better future. Honestly, I like this approach to the series. You can jump into almost anyone that interests you without needing a bunch of supplementary material beforehand, and jump straight to the next one, or go back to any others that interest you. It's not this giant collective universe with an overarching story behind it. Another big draw to Kamen Rider is that the appeal of the series is pretty broad and a lot deeper than you expect. Yeah, there's a lot of flashy action and fights once the whole superhero angle kicks in, often tending to follow the tried and true monster of the week formula, along with the occasional bit of campy humor. Kamen Rider is actually a pretty competent drama as well, and I don't just mean that it plays into the fairly common theme of what it means to be a superhero and all that, but usually unique themes that often carry across the whole series, and play a role in the development of the protagonist or other characters. It definitely keeps things interesting as each series progresses, and really makes you feel like you grow alongside these characters. But even then, with all that being said, people still ask, where do I start? Honestly, even if you just do a bit of research, you learn that it doesn't really matter. You can either start from the beginning and go from there, whatever's been rated pretty high, just start on the current series, or whatever sub-release you can manage to actually find if you're the type of person who prefers to get their media in a way that's actually legal. That's nothing, don't worry about it. As a personal recommendation, since you've already made it pretty far into this video, I'd definitely say to give Kamen Rider Build a watch. It was the one I was told to start first, and boy am I really happy that I followed up on that. An astronaut from Mars has recently returned to Earth, bringing back a mysterious artifact known as Pandora's Box. And because it's called Pandora's Box, someone winds up opening it and causes chaos. In this case, it causes the Skywall, splitting Japan into three. The three separate parts have developed into their own regions, Toto, Seito, and Hokuto. Along with that, monsters, referred to as the Smash, have been popping up and disturbing the peace as well. From there, we meet Kiryu Sento, a scientist who's also suffering from amnesia with little to no memory of his past, who takes up the mantle of the elusive Kamen Rider Build to fight off the Smash and hopefully learn more about his past, as well as Pandora's Box. Alongside him is Banjo Ryuga, a hot-headed fighter framed for a crime he didn't commit, as well as Misori Tsurugi and Sawa Takigawa, whose cafe houses him and his lab. Build's gimmick when it comes to transformation and abilities involves the full bottles, these tiny little bottles, each with essences based around objects, animals, etc., with their own traits and abilities to go with it. How Sento uses these is by combining two of them onto the driver on his belt, allowing him to transform into Build and take advantage of their abilities. There's a bunch of bottles, each with their own looks and traits that Build can use by defeating Smash and taking their essences in a very Mega Man-esque approach to getting new powers. Is it a cheap gimmick to sell lots of merchandise and figures without having to make too many changes? Yes. Do a lot of these combinations look cool as hell? Also yes. With the right bottles combined, he can unlock a best match, allowing him to use those abilities to the fullest and maybe even a finisher. His go-to is usually Rabbit and Tank, which does make sense. It's a good combination of strength and agility. There's also Gorilla and Diamond, which allows him to be a powerhouse in both strength and defense. But as the series goes on, these best matches start to get a little questionable. Why is Pirate and Train a best match? Why is Lion and Vacuum Cleaner a best match? Why is Wolf and Smartphone a best match? In fact, why is there even a smartphone bottle at all? What do you gain from using the essence of a smartphone? Funnier tweets? Radiation poisoning? But the big appeal to Build and why it managed to win over a lot of people, including myself, is definitely because there's a lot of mystery surrounding everything, and the series definitely knows how to keep you hooked and wanting to know more. What was Sento's past and how did he lose his memory? Who framed Banjo and why? How is Misori able to purify the essences of the full bottles? Why would someone intentionally bring back something called Pandora's Box to Earth? I'm actually pretty surprised that I managed to talk about Build as much as I have without dropping a huge spoiler. And with how this whole series progresses, with constant reveals and changes all leading up to the climax, I guess you can say it really builds up. While I'm here, I also want to talk about 01 as another recommendation for a starting point. From what I've seen so far, it takes a somewhat back-to-basics approach in places, while still bringing along staples of modern series. For example, the main armor brings back the classic grasshopper motif, but with a more modern, sleeker look. In the near future, a new era has begun thanks to the corporation Hiden Intelligence and their Humagear androids. AI that have become a staple in everyday life, usually doing jobs alongside human workers. After the president of the company dies, he passes ownership to his grandson, the comedian Aruto. Now having to manage the company, he also now has to take on the role of Kamen Rider 01. As with the president's death, the cyber-terrorist group MetsuboJinrai.net has risen up, hacking Humagear and sending them on destructive rampages, giving the company a bad image and putting Aruto on pretty rocky terms with AIMS, a military force made to stop Humagear that go berserk, who also come with their own Kamen Riders to fight them off. You'd think these androids, which have been around for many years, originally made for use in hospitals and are allowed around children, would be much harder to hack than slapping a belt on them, but whatever. 01 is pretty enjoyable too, and isn't overwhelming with how it tells its story. And even though Aruto might be a bit of a cringer, he definitely has this Peter Parker-esque charm to him as he starts to handle the responsibilities of managing Hiden, being a rider, and trying to get on the better side of AIMS. I also feel like it tells very interesting and somewhat down-to-earth stories regarding questions we may be asking ourselves more as we start to introduce AI more into our lives in the future. Like, is it ethical to use AI to bring back a dead loved one and live with them as if they never died? Is it possible to teach AI to have the same passion and heart for an ancient craft as a human who has dedicated their life to it? And so on. It's a somewhat simple, modern story that I feel like anyone can jump into. And because of that, if my rambling for so long hasn't convinced you already to do so, there's no reason to not give it a shot. Kamen Rider was something I wanted to get into for quite a while, but was always a bit wary about, and after my own experience with getting into it, I have definitely been won over and then some, just in time for it to turn 50. Despite that, getting to a live-action superhero story like this in this day and age definitely feels like a breath of fresh air. In the age of cinematic universes and overbearing, incredibly long slogs, it feels nice to have a small, self-contained series of cool and colorful action balanced with solid stories, as well as a bit of fun and camp thrown into the mix. And I can definitely see what Kamen Rider, along with many other series in the tokusatsu genre, have kept people hooked after all these years, especially someone who doesn't tend to sit down and watch full-length shows or binge watches like most people. Which is why this video took a little longer than usual, but ignore that. And with that, my flight is now over, and I'm off to ride into the sunset. See you next time!
ズボンのチャックは全開だけどな。
マジか。